Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to make that courtesy check that your cell phone has been turned off. It's always appreciated for those recording our events. And of course, those on the internet are welcome to send questions at any time, emailing us at speaker@heritage.org. And we will post the program on our website for everyone's future reference within 24 hours. Hosting our discussion today is Mike Frank, Vice President for Government Studies here at Heritage. He oversees our work to help members of Congress understand and defend conservative principles in exercising their constitutional powers. He previously served as Director of Communications for House Majority Leader Dick Armey of Texas, and prior to that was Heritage's Director of Congressional Relations. He also served in the Office of National Drug Control Policy and as a legislative counsel for former Representative Dannenmeyer of California. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Mike Frank. Mike?
Thank you, John. We had a panel earlier this morning, and we did this at the earlier panel. I'd like to do it again. Could you please join me in a moment of silence for the victims of the bombings in Boston? Thanks. Thank you. Well, today our topic is conservative challenges in the 113th Congress, which is the current Congress, and we are honored to have one of my favorite members of the House, Congressman Steve Scalise, to walk us through what those challenges are and how we might meet them. As you know, this country faces a lot of kind of tipping points, both from an economic standpoint, cultural standpoint. National security issues are very, very important these days. And there is really no organization within the House of Representatives, the institution I really have to say I love. I love the House. No institution is more influential and important right now than the Republican Study Committee. And Congressman Scalise recently was named by his colleagues, voted into the chairmanship of that very important organization. There's roughly 170 or so members who are join that and attend the meetings that they host and are very, very important in helping define the conservative kind of right wall of very many of these debates. Congressman Scalise is in his third term. He represents a district in the New Orleans area. He serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee and has a very strong interest in some of the issues before that committee, such as the energy issue. Which he'll, if you give him a chance, we'll talk about it, but not only eloquently, but for a long time, because he knows a whole lot about it. And he is, at a personal level, one of the most genuinely nice members I've had a privilege to work with over the years. And he'll have a lot of important things to say, and we're going to save some time for questions at the end. So please join me in giving a really warm Heritage welcome to Congressman Steve Scalise.
Well, thank you, Mike, and I appreciate the nice comments, just how we drew them up, and I appreciate. I appreciate the invitation. Heritage Foundation and the Republican Study Committee have had a very strong relationship since the beginning of the Republican Study Committee, and you know, if you look, we still have a very close bond, work together on a lot of policy initiatives. Heritage is a great sounding board, but also a great presenter of ideas. And we view the RSC as the conservative rudder of the House, the place where like-minded Republicans that are in the House come together, not just to talk about ideas, but to implement conservative policy. And we have 171 members strong at the RSC. I'm proud to be elected as chairman of the RSC, and we have a mission that we take very seriously. And if you look at the climate we're in today, you know, we're right now the real only line of defense against a radical Obama administration. And all of us were hoping for a different outcome in November. We were hoping that we would take back the White House and get control of the Senate, but that didn't happen. And so I think there was a strong realization at the beginning of this year that we're it. If there's going to be any ability to save the things that we cherish about liberty, freedom, democracy, what makes America great, it's going to come from the RSC members holding that line and serving as that last line of defense. And so that is our mission. We take it very seriously. If you look at the challenges, as Mike talked about, and I'm going to go through a number of them, but if you just look at where we are right now, in the first quarter of this year, I think we were able to bank some important wins. And by that, I want to hit on a couple of them. Because when this year started, the sequester was supposed to take place January 1st. Sequester was going to take effect where you had $85 billion of real cuts in spending. And that got delayed in the fiscal cliff deal. I opposed the fiscal cliff deal for a number of reasons, but one of them is it actually pushed those cuts off till March 1st. And it set a trend that we wanted to make sure didn't continue, of continuing to kick the can down the road, avoid the tough decisions, and never actually follow through on making cuts. And so one of the things that we did is we came together in the RC and we put a plan together for the first few months of this year, and one of those included locking in the sequester cuts and making sure they happened on March 1st. And that's something we pushed our leadership very strongly on at the beginning of this Congress. And I'm real happy to say that once March 1st came, we actually held the line, and we did finally get real cuts in spending. The president went all around the country on his sequester tour, scaring the people, and the sky was going to fall, and every food inspector was going to be laid off, and we were very aggressive in RC. And Paul Teller, our executive directors here, we organized a whole list of waste in federal spending in every federal agency. And when the president would go out and give a speech and say, if this crazy sequester happens, all these food inspectors are going to be laid off and nobody's going to be able to buy meat. And we pointed out that, under GAO reports and other reports that are out there, there's $26 billion of identified waste and fraud in the food stamp program. Why don't you actually go cut the waste instead of laying off food inspectors? And then he would start talking about closing the White House to tours of school kids. And we said, well, if you just parked Air Force One instead of flying all around the country trying to scare people, you'd save millions of dollars right there. And we went on, and with each federal agency, we had identified real waste, and we would push back. And I think ultimately the president overplayed his hand, and the country actually, I think, sided with us and said, you know what, it's about time y'all finally start cutting spending. And the $85 billion shouldn't be the end of it. It should be the beginning of what needs to happen to bring fiscal responsibility back to Washington. And so once we lock that in, you then look at what we were also able to put in place, and that was the No Budget, No Pay Act, which said the Senate hasn't passed a budget for 4 years. I think we ought to have competing visions for our country. We've passed a budget that I'm proud of the last 2 years out of the House. We brought an RC budget each year. This year, again, our budget balanced in 4 years. But one of the things we pressed our leadership on is we wanted to balance the federal budget in 10 years, within the 10-year window in the House budget that finally came to the floor. And we worked with Paul Ryan, and Paul worked very hard with his committee to produce a budget out of the Budget Committee that did just that. And I think, it starts taking responsible steps to control mandatory spending, to call for tax reform that actually lowers rates to get real economic growth, which we know the things you need to do to get the country moving again and to get the economy going again are tied together. It's not by raising taxes. If raising taxes was the problem, then we'd have a balanced budget and a humming economy right now, because President Obama got his wish in the fiscal cliff deal. Got over $600 billion in new taxes, not to mention the $1 trillion plus of new taxes in Obamacare. And we always point that out because some people want to forget that and just talk about the fiscal cliff as if there's still more they want to go do. The president's budget and the Senate budget that finally came out of this No Budget, No Pay Act showed the differences in philosophy. Our budget said we can balance in 10 years without raising a dime in new taxes through economic growth and controlled spending. The president's budget and the Senate's budget said they will never, ever get to balance, even while adding another $1 trillion in new taxes, because they continue on with these failed policies. And so I think it's important that now the American people can see those two visions. And we fought for that because it's not just a marketplace of ideas that we're having this battle, but you need to actually show on paper not just our budget, because they would demonize our budget, but then there was nothing that they stood behind. And Harry Reid was able to shield his members from taking tough votes. There were some really important votes that were taken on the Senate floor for the first time in 4 years with that budget a few weeks ago. And those senators are going to be held accountable. Next year, we've got a number of critical elections. Those senators are going to have to answer why they voted against balance in the budget, why they continue to reiterate their support for Obamacare, and so many other tough decisions that they had to make. And so what's next? First thing up in the immediate future is to get a prioritization bill. Tom McClintock, RSC, we worked very closely to put an RSC prioritization bill together that I'm a co-sponsor of, and we went to our leadership and we said we'd like this bill to come up for a vote on the House floor where we can take default off the table as an option. You know, the president loves using all these straw men and boogeymen and, you know, oh, gee whiz, if y'all have a fight over the debt ceiling, you know, you can't do that because then there's going to be the threat of default, and those Republicans just want to stop paying our debts. We said nothing's further from the truth. And the only person talking about default as an option right now is President Obama. And so we said by putting a prioritization bill in place, it would actually say that the full faith and credit of the United States government will never be at risk. If Congress can't get an agreement on the debt ceiling, then there should not be a threat of default because the country's tired of all these crises. We live crisis to crisis, and a lot of that is fabricated and manufactured by the president so you don't have to focus on the problem. I mean, the reason we keep hitting the debt ceiling is because we spend more than we take in. It's a very basic problem. You know, if you balance your books, if you live within your means, you don't hit the debt ceiling every couple of months or, you know, every year and a half, and depending on how they structure it. And so what we said is we want to actually put a plan in place that addresses the real problem. And the debt ceiling is the way to do it. You know, our budget balance is in 10 years. We want to start putting the policies in place now, between now and when the debt ceiling is hit, and sometime in June, July, August. We want to put the policies in place that actually get us to balance. And you can't have that honest conversation if the president just wants to run around and try to scare people and talk about default. And he'll do that anyway. But we're going to be saying, first of all, we're taking default off the table as an option, not something we want. If the president wants default, that's on him. We want to talk about solving the problem and controlling spending. And that means getting into the mandatory spending programs, frankly. You know, I'm proud to say when you look at what happened with sequestration, not only through sequestration, but now locked into the House budget and the Senate budget. This isn't talked about a lot. Not just the House budget, but the Senate budget both have discretionary spending numbers now below $1 trillion. That's the first time that that's happened since this president took office. And so, you know, when Obama came in, he jacked up discretionary spending in so many different areas, and we finally have brought discretionary below $1 trillion. We still have further to go, and we still need to make a lot of reforms to discretionary spending. But we all know if you want to balance your federal budget, you've actually got to make the reforms on the mandatory spending side too. We do that in our budget in the House. They don't do that in the Senate's budget. Again, that's why one of the reasons they never get to balance. But I think those are important principles to fight for. RSC is going to be continuing to put together ideas and solutions for addressing these reforms that need to happen on mandatory spending as a part of the debt ceiling negotiation. That's going to be one of the things that we'll be fighting for in the months ahead. I want to talk about Obamacare. You know, there's probably, you know, every time I go home to my district, I meet with small business owners. You talk to people that are dealing with the consequences of this massive federal government and the radical regulations, especially that are coming out of Washington. You know, and I serve on Energy and Commerce, like Mike said. We deal with the EPA. We deal with so many of the regulations. We just had a hearing with the FDA where the commissioner won't take responsibility for 53 deaths that occurred last year with the meningitis scandal, where their agency literally was ignoring their primary mission to protect health. You know, they've got the money. They weren't even denying that they didn't have the money. They just basically chose not to do their jobs for whatever reason. They don't want to have any accountability. But all of these agencies continue to put radical regulations on the backs of our small business owners, and they have dramatic negative consequences on our economy. And so when you talk about the worst ones, Obamacare always comes up as the worst. There are many others, unfortunately. I wish it was the only one. Dodd-Frank, you know, you name your litany. I mean, any industry that's out there that makes a profit. Now, if you're a solar company or, you know, wind turbine company, you got a whole lot of people protecting you so you can continue to go bankrupt. But if you're a company that actually makes a profit, there is a target on your back by this federal government and by this president. And it's unfortunately coming in so many different areas. But Obamacare is going to be one that covers across the board. You know, the president's promise, if you like what you have, you can keep it. It's broken. Millions of Americans have already lost their health care. Every employer you talk to, large, small, medium size, they're all trying to figure out how the law is going to work, but not one of them has told me that it works well for them. In fact, most of the companies, from a large company like Whole Foods with over 30,000 employees, and their employees love the health care they have. They love it. They get to vote on the benefits. That's not eligible under Obamacare. They don't know what's going to happen to those 30,000 employees who have good health care. Promise is broken. You know, he said it's not going to reduce the deficit by a dime. I mean, that doesn't even pass the laugh test anymore. And so you look at just what it's going to do. We need to continue to fight to repeal Obamacare. And I think as more of the negative consequences come out, it continues to remind people who might have forgotten, who might have thought, well, you know, we haven't seen all these things happen because 2014 is when a lot of it, ironically, after the presidential election, a lot of those negative consequences were delayed, but some of the taxes are already hitting. I mean, look at medical device tax. We're starting to see manufacturers of great life-saving medical devices that are having to move their jobs out of the country or just pull back and not be able to develop that next life-saving drug because of a tax that is in Obamacare on life-saving drugs. Again, the president's promise of if you make less than $250,000, no tax increase for you, promise broken. Over 20 new taxes that fall on the backs of middle-class families in Obamacare. We need to continue to remind people across the country how bad it is, and especially as more of it takes effect, so that we can keep making that case for repeal. But the other thing we have to do, and this is something that's an RSC initiative that we're working on, is to have an alternative, to have a replace bill. You can't just say you want to get rid of it, because before Obamacare there were problems in health care. After Obamacare, those problems are exponentially worse, but you still have to go fix the problems. The first thing you have to do is repeal Obamacare, but then you still have to address the problems of high costs, of people with pre-existing conditions being discriminated against. Those are real problems that we can fix. And in fact, many of our members of RSC, a number of our medical doctors that are in RSC have been working on a piece of legislation that would be the replace bill that RSC is going to push. And we need to do this. We need to be the ones that lead not only in fighting bad policy, but also in presenting conservative solutions to the problems that our country is facing. So another example of where we're going to be leading the effort in the RSC. And so, good to see you. Mike did mention energy, and I am more than happy to talk about energy, because if you want to talk about getting our economy back on track, energy is the first place you can start. Just look at the Keystone Pipeline. Here is a classic example, and people get this. All across the country, people now recognize that the Keystone Pipeline is something that should be approved. I mean, I told the president himself, we had a meeting, I said, with the stroke of your pen, you could create over 20,000 jobs today, and over 100,000 jobs over the next few years, as billions of dollars, maybe $5 billion of private money comes in to build that pipeline. And those are American jobs, by the way. Canada will be building the pipeline. They'll be spending their private money to build the pipeline, but the jobs that will be created will be in the United States. The benefits will be to American families, not just those who build the pipeline and who work on the pipeline, and as that new oil's coming into our refineries, but also in the form of lower gas prices. Just think about this when we talk about American energy security, and there are a lot of things we need to do. We need to develop more of the Outer Continental Shelf. You go look, the president's 5-year drilling plan he released last year closes off 85% of the areas that were getting ready to come open for leasing. The president loves to go around and brag about how production of oil's never been higher since he's been president. Okay, the only problem with that is that if you go and look, there's two different places where you can drill and develop energy. One is on public lands, one's on private lands. On private lands, it's up dramatically. On public lands, where the federal government has control, it's down dramatically. In fact, according to the President's own Energy Information Agency, it might be down around 30% because of their policies. So he's trying to brag about it on one hand, yet his agencies like EPA, Department of Interior, and everybody else are actually going after the very companies that are trying to expand energy production in America. And so you got Keystone, who's a great friend. Canada is a great trading partner. That oil's got to come from somewhere. I mean, I still don't see the president when he talks about green energy and all that. I'm all for renewables. But I don't see the president flying around on Air Force One with solar panels and wind turbines to keep the thing going. It takes fossil fuels. That's the world we live in today. You got to be honest with people about this. And he's not even going to live by his own standards, but he's going to want to try to make you have to change your lifestyle, try to raise the energy costs for America, threatening another carbon tax. Those are the things that he's trying to do, and then people go, wait a minute, why am I paying $3.50, maybe by this summer $4 a gallon for gasoline, when we're dependent on these Middle Eastern countries that don't like us for so much of our fuel? We could take 1 million barrels a day from Canada that would no longer have to get from Middle Eastern countries. You talk about a great trade difference. When we trade with Canada, we get 85 cents on the dollar back. When we trade with Saudi Arabia or some of these other countries that don't like us, we get less than 50 cents on the dollar back. Everything about it makes sense. But the president's bound down to these radical environmentalists and some of his other friends that just don't want fossil fuels in America. They want you all to pay $5, $6 a gallon for gasoline and pay much higher electricity costs. And unfortunately, they're winning right now. But I think the public has turned on them. We're going to continue to fight this battle, and we're going to bring energy legislation out of the House too. And RSC members have drafted really strong proposals to do just that. I want to hit on a few other things. We're seeing some legislation move in the Senate on gun control. I can tell you this, when you look at the Schumer Manchin-Toomey bill, I have some real concerns about it. I think the fact that you have liberals that want to just, anytime there's a tragedy, they want to go exploit it and try to push for more gun control. It tells you that, you look at the bill, even the latest proposal, not one of those proposals would have done anything to end the tragedy, to stop the tragedy from Sandy Hook from happening. Our hearts all went out to those kids and those families. But you don't take away the rights of law-abiding citizens because somebody stole his mom's gun and killed his mom and then went and broke over probably 40 different laws to commit a horrible crime. I mean, anybody that's going to try to tell you that putting yet one more law on top of the 40 he already broke was going to have anything to do to stop it. And by the way, he didn't violate any of the things that they're proposing. So it wouldn't have anything to do with Sandy Hook. And yet they shamelessly go and hide behind the victims to try to pass radical gun control proposals. So we're going to strongly fight that. In fact, I put together a Second Amendment task force in the RSC, and we have Marlon Stutzman from Indiana heading that up. We had our first meeting last week with a very strong turnout. So you're going to see RSC members very actively engaged in the fight to protect our Second Amendment rights. We take it very seriously. You look at the fight for life. What's going on at this Philadelphia Gosnell trial, the fact that the mainstream media refuses to even cover the fact that a doctor murdered 7 babies who were born alive. They were botched abortions. And the babies were born alive, and then he killed them after they were born. If he used an AK-47 to commit those crimes, we would be seeing that on the news as if it was another national disaster. And it would have been. But he used a scalpel instead. And so the mainstream media, I guess, is okay with that. We should not be okay with that. We're talking about it. We're not only sending out press releases, we're sending letters out, and we're talking about this wherever we can go to remind people that this really happened. And even though the mainstream media refuses to talk about it, we need to let people know just what the consequences are to what he did. And so, in conclusion, there are a lot of really big challenges, heady challenges that are facing the RSC. But we're up to the challenge. We're really excited about the opportunity to at least be in a majority where we can go and fight to defend the freedoms that we all believe in. I came to Congress because I was really concerned about the direction of our country. I've got a 6-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son. I want to make sure that they have the same opportunity to achieve the American dream that I've got today. But I think everybody in this room knows it is at risk if we don't stand up and defend it with everything we have. And so that's why I'm proud to be the head of a group that has 171 members of Congress that came here to be a part of that fight. And we work with Heritage Foundation and so many other great organizations that have those same beliefs. So we're excited about our opportunity. We know it's not easy. If it was easy, they could just bring in some other folks to do it. But we know what our task is. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Congressman. Questions now? We have microphones. Please get a microphone before you ask a question. The lady here, and please identify yourself for our benefit. Right there you go. There you go.
Yeah, Doris Eisen. I had heard that your committee was looking at, and this is a little germane today, didn't cover anything you've covered right now, but the Al Jazeera Al Gore deal, and that there were certain issues in that in which you've got terrorist funding, possibly, and that deal, has that deal gone through for sure? Have you guys examined it? That we have more access, that Al Jazeera will have so much more access with Al Gore's deal.
Yeah, and there are a few different committees that I think are looking at it. I don't think there have been any. I'll set my timer to make sure I didn't go over time. It's, Energy and Commerce has jurisdiction over the FCC, but I think some of the national security committees are looking at this as well. So there are a few people that are looking into it, and I encourage them to pursue. And and clearly, if there's anything that is either violation or potential violation of law, we ought to pursue it. And so, like I said, there are a number of members through a few different committees that are looking at that right now.
Woman in the back there.
Hi, I'm Barbara Dello, and I'm a Heritage member. Obamacare, we had 2 elections where Obamacare was one of the big issues. And in both cases, premium support lost in both elections.
What are you basing that on, if I can interject?
Well, it was a debate. One of the big issues in the election was health care reform. And the Democrats were proposing Obamacare, and the Republicans were proposing, you know, the voucher system or the premium support plan. And Heritage has done a masterful job showing us how bad Obamacare is, and it is. I'm a nurse as well, so I know. Does the Republican Party have a new option that'll be more palatable to the American people if we can get rid of Obamacare?
Yeah, let me mention two things. First of all, if you look at the 2010 election, when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker, Obamacare was probably the main, if not one of the main 2 or 3 items that was, I think, the biggest concern to American people. And when races were contested, Obamacare was usually the biggest issue for those members that voted to pass Obamacare, and we actually won the majority, I think, in large part because of Obamacare. You know, the economy to a second degree, some of the spending and regulations, but Obamacare was the biggest regulation, and repeal of Obamacare was the mantra in 2010, and in fact, Nancy Pelosi, I think, got fired in large part because of Obamacare. If you look at the 2012 presidential election, absolutely we lost the presidential election, but I would contend to you that it wasn't because of our position versus the president's position on Obamacare. In fact, I would suggest if you look at the debates and even a lot of the rhetoric in the campaign, Mitt Romney was not real comfortable talking about health care, and so didn't really go after the president on Obamacare because of the Massachusetts model. And so where our members actually took on health care, and we were attacked on premium support. Every single one of us that voted for the budget in 2011, and 2012, and 2010, we were all attacked on the vote for reforming Medicare so that it can actually sustain itself and move into a premium support model. And we won that debate. Of course, we won the House on that. And each, not just members of Congress, but the candidates, Republican candidates who never voted for premium support were asked, every single one of them, where do you stand on this? You couldn't play the middle of the road, and they had to pick a side, and all of our winning candidates actually said we're for premium support and against Obamacare, and we won and kept the House. But if you look at the exit polling, we lost a lot of different issues on exit polling, unfortunately. But one we won was premium support, because it was front and center with that election cycle, and people were asked about it, and the voters of this country, and especially seniors, actually sided with us and said, you know what, we don't like the fact that Medicare is going bankrupt in part because of Obamacare. There's an actual real plan that people liked called premium support that reforms it.
This gentleman down here, can you have a microphone?
Thomas from the Daily Caller. I just had a question about the sequester. There were a lot of Republicans who didn't come out for it so forcefully as you just did. For instance, Bob McDonnell in Virginia was against military cuts, and then there was I think a bill recently passed in the House that tried to hand over more authority to the president to fine-tune it. But you're happy with the way the sequester panned out?
Yeah, I always said that I'd much rather see targeted cuts. And let's go in. I was concerned about the level of cuts in the Department of Defense. I voted for legislation that shifted many of those defense cuts over to non-defense discretionary. That didn't ultimately become law. But at the end of the day, I said, we have got to control spending. And that means cutting some things that we like. We've ultimately got to start cutting spending. And the first $85 billion is not the end. There's going to be other things, and there are going to be things Republicans and Democrats don't like. The bottom line is we're so far beyond the constitutional requirements and even, I think, minimums that we should be doing. We've got to start making some changes and reforms to how we spend money. And the sequester wasn't the cleanest way to do it. If I was drawing it up on my own, it would be a lot different. But at the end of the day, your choice is, do you cut $85 billion of a bloated federal government budget or not? The answer is absolutely yes, you do that, and then you start working on the next 85.
Question? Yes, sir.
Richard Cavalier with the Heritage Foundation. You spoke at length about energy and specifically Keystone Pipeline and oil, but a large majority of the country still gets their energy from coal and a large percentage of nuclear as well. And with the Republican Party being notorious for being in bed with big oil, do you think it'd be beneficial for the party to concentrate more on things like that, like Coal River, West Virginia, for instance, or renewing our nuclear energy usage in the country as well?
Absolutely, and I'm an all of the above guy, and as opposed to the president who's for all above and nothing below. I think we ought to utilize all of our natural resources, and as it relates to energy, we've got so many of them. I want to see us expand our nuclear capabilities, make it easier to pursue nuclear and properly store it, we built Yucca Mountain. We spent billions of dollars of taxpayer money to build it, and yet they're still not utilizing that. We need to really fix that problem. But we also need to do more with coal. The fact that, in South Louisiana, district I represent, there are mountains of coal right now at the mouth of the Mississippi River because they're exporting so much of it because the EPA made it so difficult to use coal in the United States, and it's a very efficient form of energy. There are many coal plants that are being shut down, and it's leading to higher electricity prices. I want to reverse that. I voted for legislation to reverse that. We need to open up more areas for oil and natural gas. We need to keep the EPA out of hydraulic fracturing regulations. It's done at the state level, and they do a great job at doing it. EPA doesn't need to come in and mess it up. We also need to continue to explore the technology and expand the technology and develop the technology for wind and solar. They're not viable sources of energy today to produce much more than, if you maxed out on wind and solar today, maxed out, you wouldn't get 20% of your household electricity, not to mention your transportation fuels. And so anybody that's running around saying replace fossil fuels with wind and solar, you need to do both. You need to continue to expand. But anybody who suggests that you can replace one with the other is just lying to you. And so, we talk about all of the above and we mean it, but the president talks about the above, but he wants to shut down all the fossil fuels below. And so that's the biggest difference between our approaches.
See, I told you he knows a lot about energy policy. Okay, questions? There's a question over there. Laura. Thank you for the microphone.
Laura Truman with the Heritage Foundation. The debt limit is the next big fight, and I know that conservatives in the House are expecting to get something in exchange for any vote or potential vote for a debt limit increase. I was wondering what's really most important to you in terms of a real change, what you would like to see be attached to that.
Well, and it's a critical question because between now and July, August, whenever that final date is that we actually exceed the debt limit and they can't do the extraordinary measures that they'll do, we've got an opportunity to lay out not only the argument for why we keep hitting the debt ceiling, but to start talking about real solutions. Again, take default off the table and let's have an honest conversation about how we stop our country from continuing to hit the debt ceiling. And to me, if you want to really solve that problem, you've got to get into the mandatory spending side of government because you can zero out everything on discretionary and you'll still have a deficit. We've got to get our economy moving again. We've got to remove that uncertainty. And if we actually put the reforms in place on the mandatory spending side that get us to that 10-year balance, then that to me is what the discussion over the debt ceiling should be about because that's where you really solve the problem. If the president doesn't want to talk about that, then he's admitting that he just wants to continue driving our country down a road of despair that's going to lead us to Greece. And I'm not willing to accept that approach. And so I think we need to have a big discussion on big ideas about how you reform mandatory spending in the context of the debt ceiling so you don't keep hitting the debt ceiling.
Right here? Question right here.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Eel, and I was wondering if you could talk about education really quick, what sort of priorities you might have, and if any bills might be able to be passed in the near future.
I hope we address education reform at the federal level, especially as it relates to school choice for families. I think one of the great success stories, I was born in the city of New Orleans. I served on the board of Teach for America in New Orleans before I came to Congress. Prior to Hurricane Katrina, back before 2005, New Orleans had probably the most corrupt and failed public school system in the country. You had over 60,000 students, over $500 million budget, and you literally had kids graduating, high school valedictorian that graduated and couldn't pass the state exit exam. That's how failed and corrupt that system was. And so after Hurricane Katrina, we had a real opportunity to fix things that were broken. And I was in the state legislature at the time. We put in place a charter school system that's now looked at as the model for the nation. We completely transformed what was the most failed school system that is now looked at. The New Orleans public school system is now viewed as the model for transforming failed public education in the country. And we did it by ending, we had a big fight with the teachers union over putting kids before union contracts, and so we ended the collective bargaining agreement and said, you know what, a principal ought to be able to hire the best teachers at their school. I mean, crazy concept, right? We had a war over that, but we won that battle. And now when you go to a school, the teachers that are there are the best and brightest that, focusing on the kids' education, and instead of the unions just being concerned about protecting the very small percentage of bad teachers, which is the way that they often operate. And so it's a great model for how I think a lot of other education systems can be reformed across the country. And so, I do think we ought to take it on, because the things that the liberals have been defending is the status quo that actually has led to failure. And where you've seen success, it's been by breaking that model.
My favorite people in Washington.
Winsome Packer with the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. I was wondering if you have, what do you think the balance should be between addressing contemporary threats such as terrorism with the government's creeping unconstitutional intrusion into ordinary citizens' communications and other private aspects of their life?
It's one of those balances that we always discuss when we're bringing up national security legislation. I really was proud of what Rand Paul did. I stand with Rand when he actually took to the Senate floor and raised concerns about the president giving some kind of hesitation over whether or not on United States soil they could use a drone to take out an American citizen without due process. I thought that crossed the line on constitutional questions. It shouldn't have been a question. Eric Holder should have been able to say unequivocally, no, that's not a power or an ability that we have as the United States government, but they refused to do that. And so what Rand said is that's one of those areas where you cross the line. What we can do in foreign countries where we're fighting al-Qaeda is a different story, and the courts have even said that. But if you look at American soil, we've got to be very careful to protect the rights of American citizens, and we should not allow or let the president think that he's got the ability to pick and choose who he can go and target on American soil without a due process.
Question in the back, gentlemen, I guess. Oh, I'm sorry. One more. I'm sorry. We have a vote.
We're going to have votes on the House floor.
The last question over there. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Mike Morrison from the American Energy Alliance, and I just wanted to ask you really quickly about the carbon tax. There's an effort among the way under some conservatives are trying to push the idea of a carbon tax. Would you comment on these so-called conservatives and their new tax ideas?
Well, there's an effort underway by me and many others to prevent any kind of carbon tax from being imposed. I filed a piece of legislation. I think we're over 100 co-sponsors now. Over 100 co-sponsors in the House that have already signed on that would say that there will be no carbon tax in the United States. Again, this is something that the President tried through cap and trade. Nancy Pelosi pushed that through Congress and the House. It did pass, went over to the Senate. When Harry Reid had a filibuster-proof Senate, he still didn't even try to bring it up because it was such a bad idea. Yet the EPA and other agencies are still trying to ram it through. They're still trying to float that idea out there. And so what we said is we ought to have a vote on the House floor. I sure would like to see this legislation come to the House floor where we all go on record and say we're opposed to a carbon tax. It would devastate our economy, and foreign countries might like it because it would hurt our economy, but we should close that door completely.
Okay, on that note, please join me in a warm round of applause for Congressman.
Thank you all for having me.
Good job.